Hello, and welcome to Reimagine Jobs Spotlight on Grid Modernization. I'm your host, Amanda Woodrum. I am the Senior Researcher at Policy Matters Ohio and co-director of the project to Reimagine Appalachia. We are a 4-state campaign representing diverse stakeholders across the Ohio River Valley region of Appalachia, also known as coal country. We grew out of the great work done by the Pennsylvania League of Women Voters, Climate Reality, Breathe Project, and many others dedicated to reimagining their local communities. And we are working hard to secure the Ohio River Valley's fair share of national climate infrastructure investments. Tonight, we are joined by several esteemed panelists who are working on grid modernization in the region, and I can personally attest to their brilliance. Tonight's program is part of the Reimagine Jobs Showcase, an effort launched in September of last year and encapsulated in the website www.reimaginejobs.org. The goal of this website is to highlight sustainable economic development initiatives and job opportunities in and around Southwest Pennsylvania. It features local businesses and organizations in 9 sectors of sustainable economic development. Tonight's program on grid modernization is the 8th in a series of programs doing a deep dive in each of those 9 sectors. And we encourage you to take a look at the website and explore the exhibitors and opportunities listed. Again, the website is www.reimaginejobs.org. Tonight, we will be hearing from Garrettson Oster of Reimagine Appalachia and Sarah Dougherty of Bright, an energy tech incubator operating in the region. These presentations will highlight current initiatives as well as opportunities in grid modernization. We will then have an opportunity for general Q&A. We ask that you put your questions for all of the panelists into the chat. And after the Q&A, we will then have breakouts where you'll be able to choose the room that most interests you. And in that breakout, you'll be able to network and have more specific and informal conversations about that topic. So thanks again for joining us tonight, and let's get started. So first, what do we mean when we say modernizing the grid? What is a grid? And what we're talking about is largely the electric power grid, but it also carries cable and telecommunications wires that it's how we get both electricity and internet into our homes and businesses. I like to describe it as the big brown poles and black wires that you see everywhere. And if you can picture those big brown poles and black wires, you can imagine that it is in desperate need of an upgrade. They look a lot like they did before World War II. And as we move towards a modern economy and as we face the impacts of climate change, it becomes increasingly obvious that the time has come to invest in that grid and to do the work of upgrading it and bringing it into the 21st century. This is very important not only to national security, but as we see increasingly severe storms, we're going to need to put more of that grid underground. As we move towards electric vehicles, whether they're passenger vehicles or school buses, electric school buses, or electric public transit, all of which will plug into that grid, will need to be reinforcing that grid or beefing it up, so to speak. Perhaps most importantly, our current form of electrifying everything revolves around a very centralized system of energy generation. So we have very large coal plants in remote areas. They produce the electricity and move it along the lines. But these coal plants are pretty inefficient and outdated. In a more modern economy, we will see more distributed forms of generation, renewable energy. So we're talking about solar as well as wind farms and wind turbines more specifically. So it's not just one location. We will see them in many locations, and they need to all hook up to the grid. We also need to see more efficient forms of heating and powering manufacturing. And so that's going to look a little bit different. And as we start using more and more renewable energy, we'll see more ways to store that energy. And so battery technology becomes an important piece of what it means to modernize the grid. And of course, all of this encompasses the need to build out more universal broadband. And so as you think about those things, you can almost imagine as well the workforce implication that go along with those investments. It's going to create a lot of jobs, and not just any job. These are going to be very good jobs. So following all of that, if you're following right now in the news, you will probably be aware of the fact that Congress is debating a couple infrastructure packages. There's a bipartisan infrastructure package and a budget reconciliation infrastructure package. And both of those packages include billions of dollars towards modernizing and upgrading our electric grid. So if we can make it past any political obstacles and those bills become law, we will in fact see significant investments to modernize the grid, and that means significant numbers of jobs that will be created. So lots of job opportunities in this arena, and we will explore that in today's session. So that's sort of my spiel, and now I'm going to turn it over to Garrett Oster. And first, I want to introduce you to him. I'll tell you a little bit about him. He is a clean energy advocate, researcher, and consultant who works with sustainability issues, focusing specifically on the infrastructure and technology challenges associated with enabling a low carbon future. He has worked for Fortune 500 organizations and global NGOs, as well as local governments and transit agencies. Garrett's current engagement with Reimagine Appalachia focuses heavily on the role that transportation electrification will play towards modernizing the grid. And that includes greening our transit fleets, and of course in Pennsylvania, but also in surrounding states, and promoting more equitable economic development in the region, as well as access to good paying jobs. Garrett maintains active research relationships in urban economics topics with faculty at Harvard and Case Western, where he studied. And I can tell you that he is one of the favorite research assistants of a certain Case Western professor who is now on leave to be a senior advisor to the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Welcome, Garrett, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Amanda. Very, very kind introduction, and it's very good to be with you. Thanks to the League of Women Voters of Southwestern Pennsylvania, Climate Reality Project, Breathe, and all the organizations that are putting together this Reimagine Jobs Spotlight, especially around a topic that I'm very personally passionate and interested about, which focuses on grid modernization, our power infrastructure, and ultimately sustainability and clean energy. I'm going to spend about 10 or 15 minutes talking a bit of and sharing a bit of background on grid modernization, what it means, what it looks like, and some of the trends that are kind of existing within the industry today. Then I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk a bit about the current infrastructure bills that are winding their way through Congress, maybe break down a bit of some of those headline numbers that people have seen and try and bring that to reality. And lastly, link that all back together to some of the career opportunities that exist in the power sector and will come along with grid modernization activities before hopefully setting up your next speaker, who's really a pretty stellar person in their own right. So maybe we get right to it and we start talking a bit about grid modernization, what it looks like, what it means. This is a term that I think sounds very complicated and complex. And I think Amanda set it up really beautifully in just kind of describing it as the poles and wires that you see outside of your window. The power grid is something that's a pretty miraculous feat of modern technology and engineering. If you think about the systems in your lives that you depend on and don't really think much about at all, power and water are probably the two systems that come to mind. There's really no other system or logistics enterprise, though Amazon is trying, that can rival these two in terms of the delivery of the same product everywhere across the country instantaneously. And that's a pretty remarkable feat of modern engineering. Much of that really has been unchanged, as Amanda said, for much of the 1900s and really to today. The same kinds of technologies are being used right now to deliver the electricity that's powering my laptop and probably all of your devices, as were used in the early 1900s. And while these technologies have advanced in kind of a stepwise way, there's not been a whole lot of kind of breakthrough innovation that has significantly altered how the grid operates. As we think about the grid, it's about 7 million miles of wire, according to Bloomberg, who kind of went through the estimation process on that. And it really spans everything from the individual connection to your home all the way to those large-scale transmission lines that you see on the highways. When we think about grid modernization, I think there are really a couple of trends that, we're seeing in the industry. And those are really around, one, upgrading the infrastructure that's reached the end of its useful life. So that could be, an individual wire that's running down your street that is, 40, 50, 60 years old, and it may not meet modern standards, or it may be just kind of wearing out through usage and it's time for replacement. The second big trend that kind of exists in the grid modernization space is bringing advanced communication and control features to that infrastructure. And this is one of those new innovations that has really kind of taken off over the past 20, 30 years, which is the ability for utilities, whether kind of the big investor-owned utilities or local and rural cooperatives, to understand what's happening on the grid and control it. And that can look like being able to flick a switch in a control room and reroute power, or to understand, through a smart meter on your home or in your apartment building that you've lost power without you having to call the utility. So those are the kinds of trends that we see in the grid modernization space. And, as Amanda said, there are a lot of, there's been a lot of emphasis recently on the new infrastructure bills winding their way through Congress as really the next big investment in the power grid. This is very similar to the big investment that came after the 2008 recession, as Congress and the rescue funds that were appropriated were directed towards the grid. And so it's been about 12, even 13 years since we've seen a huge federal investment in that infrastructure. I think many of you may have seen some of these top line numbers that have come out of the halls of Congress and the White House around, $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging, $7.5 billion for transit and transportation initiatives, and this really large number, which is kind of the $73 billion for clean energy and grid enhancements. All of these pools of money break down into specific sub-allocations, and they all exist over kind of a 5-year horizon. So as we think about that 73 billion, that's not 73 billion each year, that's 73 billion, over a 5-year window. And each of those buckets exists within a specific space of the federal kind of departments that are going to administer these funds. So for instance, some of those are allocated through the Department of Energy, others through the Department of Transportation, to really provide access for utilities, for agencies, for local governments, and for other organizations that own, operate, and have a role in the power grid and grid modernization to request grants for specific projects that they're interested in carrying out. For those projects, there's generally a 100% matching fund requirement. So the federal government will contribute 50% and the entity will have to contribute another 50%. And as we think about those funds, 30% of them are targeted towards small utilities. If we think about the utility landscape here, the Energy Information Agency has the numbers that, out of about 3,000 utilities, there are 168 that are big corporations that serve approximately 3/4 of households. But the remainder, so the other 2,830 some odd utilities, are municipal and cooperative. So these serve rural communities. They also serve cities and small towns. And so they're guaranteed 30% of those funds for the 1/4 of the population that they provide power to. What's interesting about these funds is that they're not nearly enough to tackle the infrastructure backlog that we see in, not only our own region, but across the country. And some recent research that we've been undertaking with the Reimagine Appalachia project really highlights this. And that research is focused on transit electrification. The headline number is that between Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Kentucky, there's approximately $10 billion of investment needed to electrify all of the transportation and transit fleets in that region. And that includes both the buses as well as the grid that's required to power the buses. If we think about the federal funding, though, and what was allocated through the recent bill that, still is winding its way through Congress, there's approximately $2.5 billion that was allocated for zero emission buses across the United States. So even with the matching funds, we see that there is still a shortfall in provisioning the appropriate funds to really meet that infrastructure backlog, as well as to advance and accelerate our electrification. And this has direct correlations for the workforce. As I look at the workforce and think about, what the grid modernization effort looks like, it really spans industries and companies in ways that many people don't imagine. When most people think of grid modernization, their first thought are, of course, the line people. So those are the hardworking utility workers. They're generally unionized, who we see in the bucket trucks on the side of the road. They're the folks who come out when our power goes out in the middle of the storm and help get the lights back on. And that is a huge segment of our workforce that is related to grid modernization. However, if we look more broadly, there are lots of other players in the grid modernization space. Grid modernization is like any large-scale project. It requires project management and supply chain experts. It requires individuals with advanced engineering backgrounds to help plan the electrical systems. And it also requires factory and manufacturing roles. Many of the companies that support the utilities and the power grid have significant presence in our region. So these are companies like General Electric, Eaton, Siemens, Westinghouse. These are all companies that exist within the power supply chain. And then, of course, there are others in sales and software. And as we see, Amanda highlighted another trend, which is the advancement of clean energy. There are going to be other jobs still that emerge from this. So these can be electricians who might help a family add a charging station for their new electric car in their garage, or these could be solar panel installation folks or wind technicians. So there's a lot of good jobs out there, and many of these jobs are high paying. And I think that's something that's often, not necessarily understood about the workforce in this particular sector of the economy, is that not only are these jobs high paying, for instance, I was on the Duquesne Light website earlier today. They're hiring line people with experience at $50 an hour is the starting rate for those jobs. But not only are they hiring, experienced line people, most utilities also offer full training programs for many of the jobs in these industries. So you can apply to become an apprentice with just a high school degree, and then just work your way through the trainings and certification programs, everything from CDLs and driver's licenses through to electrical and electrician knowledge assessments to become a certified lineman on the utility's dime and working for the utility. So not only is this a sector where there is burgeoning employment, there's also an immense ability to learn on the job and train, which is something that's particularly special about the coming investments in grid modernization and what that means for the workforce in our region. I'll pause there. Amanda, back to you.
All right. That was so awesome, Garrett. Thank you for your presentation. I know there's questions for you, but let's go ahead and switch over to our second presentation, Sarah Dougherty. Sarah is the Director of Partnerships at Bright, which I already mentioned is an energy tech incubator in the region. And she manages the day-to-day operations at Bright, including business and program development, marketing and event planning, grant writing, and acts as a scrum master to keep the team in line. I call that herding cats. Prior to Bright, she was a program manager and long-range planner for economic development and transportation initiatives. Currently, Sarah serves on community boards, including as the finance chair for the Raymond John Ween Foundation. She is also the secretary of the local YMCA in Mahoning Valley, as well as Simply Slavic. She graduated with degrees in interdisciplinary studies and city and regional planning from Miami University and Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, respectively. She also spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in the Ukraine. And when Sarah joined the team, she brought along her dog, a Frenchie, Kobzar, who acts as Bright's chief morale officer. And I encourage every organization to have such a chief morale officer. Welcome, Sarah, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I forgot that was a little long, all the details there. I'll make sure you even got the boards on there. That's pretty cool. All right, sharing some slides here just to go through today. I really want to thank everyone for the invitation. I'm excited for this conversation. I've become engulfed in this issue. I didn't intend for that to become my life, but it is. And so I'm very excited for the conversation today. I will briefly provide an overview of our organization for some context. Then I will get into some of the companies we work with and talking about the jobs they are creating and their workforce needs. And then going to look at some industry trends as well to help kind of spark some of the dialogue that we have afterwards. So real quick about Bright's Energy Innovators. We were founded as kind of that third space between utilities, academia, and inventors to work together, recognizing energy innovation is really hard. It's capital intensive, it's time intensive. I like to say with software, you can assume, you can quickly build an app and get it up on the store. It's a little different in energy technology, almost, kind of similar to the medical field with all the certification that's required, but it's just very capital intensive. We find it takes about 6 to 7 years for something to go from something that's commercially viable to market. So I really stress that point. We're here in Warren out of interest in the economic development community, especially in Northeast Ohio, and having this type of space, recognizing all the assets in the region mentioned, like Eaton, Parker Hannifin, utilities like First Energy and AEP having their headquarters in Ohio. And then interest in the local community of Warren, really wanting to set the stage and show that they're forward thinking, getting rid of the old image of just being tied to very intensive industries. So we were created as a third space and started launching our services in 2012 and opened our building in 2015. And here I like to show this image. Our name was the Tech Belt Energy Innovation Center, recognizing from the Rust Belt to the Tech Belt, expanding from Cleveland to Pittsburgh to Morgantown. When we were going out in the community and explaining ourselves, we spent more time talking about this faux geographic region than about our mission. So about 2 years ago, we simply became Bright. And I'd like to share that Bright is not an acronym, which I consider a success on my part. I think, and particularly in the engineering space, there's just way too many acronyms. We chose Bright actually because it's a Celtic name, meaning light and innovation and those types of things. And it's actually a female name, and which kind of goes down to one of our core values around inclusiveness and how we really want to diversify what it means to be an energy founder. And I can do this. All right, so our main services are entrepreneur services. So these are the different stages by which we see companies, really providing them help in determining what their market is, helping them with their business plans, and then connecting them to capital. I'd say during the pandemic, we were overwhelmed. We saw a 4x or quadruple increase in demand for services. We see this as, people maybe had a little more time on their hands towards the beginning of the pandemic, and really was a time for new discovery. And it really has just continued to increase since then. I say on average, we get 4 new company inquiries a week. And so we're continuing to build our team and address this. At our site in Warren, we have these Bright Energy Labs where we have advanced equipment for battery testing, grid integration, and Internet of Things testing. So a lot of this stuff is a little over my head, but we have different developers creating switches. So if there's a brownout or a blackout, these switches can help with that process so that you don't lose power so quickly. It can route to different power sources. That was something that's been developed in our lab. Various types of battery technologies for drones or unmanned aerial devices. We see that as a really growing field with needs surrounding energy storage and endurance, as well as sensors, any sort of connected smart device. We can test the battery of that, make sure it's secure, the lifespan of it, and make sure that it doesn't have any interference. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm trying to choose what I pick here. And I thank you for your patience. I think it's like you have a whole universe in your mouth and you just want to say it all at one time, but I'll get there. So since we started those entrepreneur services in 2012, we've assisted over 500 startups. And in turn, those startups have attracted over 200 million in investment, and approximately 1,200 jobs have been created through our companies. We do twice a year surveys assessing where they are. And energy tech is very broad. It goes, from solar to agricultural tech to wind technology. As an organization, and as we start to evolve and find our own space and look at the federal trends as well as what's needed in our local community and the needs there, our focus is really energy storage. So batteries or other things like fuel cells that act as a catalyst for storing energy. Grid resilience, a lot of that is the software around making sure, like I was mentioning earlier with the brownouts and monitoring the grid. And then electric mobility. So working in the electric vehicle space, whether it's batteries for EVs, automotive manufacturers creating the vehicles themselves, charging infrastructure software, optimization of fleets for charging. It's still a pretty large gambit. To talk about some of these companies, one example is Paragon Robotics, which is based out of Cleveland. They work with utility scale microgrids and renewable energy. That's a technology that's a company to consider in this grid space. Exactor, which is headquartered in Columbus, they have a unique partnership with the city of Akron, where they use a monitoring device on the city's garbage trucks, and it tests the radio frequency. So the sensor, when it goes around the city every week, monitors the grid, and by doing so, they're able to use machine learning and notify if there's any changes in the grid. So if there's any changes in the heat or signs of interference, and then it allows for preventative maintenance. Also, just Lion Tamer, another Columbus company working on the safety of batteries, which of course is big in this news in this past week with some of the issues that we've seen. So if I were to talk more so about some of the jobs that we're seeing created with our startups, I'd say they kind of fall into three buckets initially with startups. First is just marketing and needing to sell the products. A lot of sales and development people, that's really where we're seeing a lot of jobs being created right here at the headquarters of the incubator. Outside of that, really a lot with embedded software and programming. So taking a piece of hardware and connecting it to a cloud or an internet service. And lastly is prototyping or manufacturing. So assembling these hardware devices that go and then are eventually connected to the grid. And then when we talk later in in the discussion, maybe I can go into some other technologies that are grid related and the potential jobs in those spaces. Now, for this space, it's kind of fun to be asked to speak on something where you don't feel like you're an expert, and then you feel like you have to know a little bit of everything about everything. And I've spent the last couple of days really looking at this and crowdsourcing among a group that I really admire. I'm very thankful this year to take part in the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, which is a national program that's been around for about 5 years. Previously, the program was only available in the Bay Area, New York, Chicago, and DC. And with the pandemic, they opened up a national class. And I think there's 3 or 4 people in the Appalachian footprint, including someone at Carnegie Mellon and Appalachian Voices that's taking part in it. It's been a phenomenal resource. And one thing I really like is that I'm getting to meet like middle management, emerging leaders at some of the utilities that are talking about this issue and considering the workforce needs, and then it just off the cuff, talking about some of the challenges that they have there. And so, speaking to some of those colleagues, they really stressed some of these points here, which kind of goes towards Garrett's earlier comments about that shift from the poll workers or thinking of it as construction to software and control. So less of what you physically see and more of the connected tissue, which is why I share this graphic here about the cloud and the grid 4.0. And you see it's vehicle to grid, it's building to grid, it's everything to grid. It's all interconnected in this decentralized system. And the other part I talked about is just general electrification across the board. Sometimes we talk the power and utility is shrinking as an industry in general because we're seeing this decentralization. We think of the big orgs getting smaller, but that is by no means true because they're getting into these exact spaces like building electrification and electrical vehicle infrastructure. There's these whole new business lines that these utilities have to consider. And with that, the real need for business development people, communications people to work with customers to explain all these opportunities. I'm sure we've all seen newspaper clippings about the horrors of rolling out smart meters and other devices, and just how critical those are as we move forward and integrate more renewables into how we deliver power. And lastly, just the real push for diversity and inclusion. I was looking at some statistics, and less than 5% of the solar manufacturing workforce or solar installation workforce today is African American. Less than a quarter of the solar workforce is female. So there's those issues, historic issues of the STEM and pathways towards energy technology that need to be addressed. And the complete disruption in the 80s and 90s when there was such a push for higher education and four-year degrees, and that really kind of crippled some of the apprenticeship programs and the things that we're really asking for today. And these are great jobs, but they're to be a lineman takes 7 years of training, so it's by no means a little thing to do. I will add some things we're working on in this space as a tech incubator. We tried to stay out of workforce for as long as we could because we're a small team, we're still young, we're trying to figure out how to deliver the best services to startups. But because everything is happening right now, and with the infrastructure bill, we are getting more involved in the workforce space. So right now, working with Youngstown State University through the Department of Energy on an asset map of the needs for the energy storage, everything from stationary storage, so backup power, to transportation, to the medical field. So we'll be working with all the national labs across the country and some of the larger employers to kind of codify what types of jobs there are in energy storage, and that will be exciting. Also through the investments in our local community of LG Chem and GM into the Ultium plant, which will be replicated in Tennessee and probably other places across the country. We're starting to map pathways for battery manufacturing jobs, which includes like industrial maintenance, a lot of safety and controls. So those are things that we'll be rolling out over the 6 to 9 months that we're really looking forward to doing. I share this quote, which I hate when people share quotes or long passages on slides, but here I did it. I was really impressed by this EY Global press release from earlier this year. I think it's a powerful statement about what we're against, these words like disruptive. There's just so much to consider at this time. And really looking at this article and looking at the scenarios related to what the Biden administration has set forth as far as their carbon reduction goals. If that were the scenario we choose through policy, that would lead to a triple, an increase in jobs in just the power sector alone. That does not include manufacturing of solar or wind turbines. Those are, those lineman jobs and things like that. But also there are some things that I think during today's discussion we should consider. Yes, these are good paying jobs, but they do not equal the wages of jobs in extraction of coal and some of those things that I think really brought Reimagine Appalachia together and the things we need to talk about. There's also the issue of geographic dislocation. Currently with power generation being really centralized in Appalachia, what's going to happen if it's decentralized? Like, are we going to be able to capture all the tech jobs related to this increase? And also just the need for rebranding. When I think of the grid and utilities, I do think of the linemen, which I'm kind of jealous of because they have to be super strong. And I'm also mad because my cousin couldn't be one because he's flat-footed. But anyways, it's this whole different skill sets that need to be considered. And so much like we're seeing how manufacturing jobs are being rebranded, the utility sector needs to do the same. Another article I highly recommend checking out from June of this year. It's from Deloitte Insights about the decarbonized power workforce. This was really helpful for me in better understanding some of the integrations that we're seeing in our community, specifically with, say, University of Pittsburgh and starting their digital skills certifications and things we're seeing at Youngstown State University around data analysis. According to this article, 35% of job postings in utilities are IT jobs, and that's going to continue to increase. And I know these graphics are overwhelming, but I think this provides a bit of context to what we're talking about here and what we're seeing. And this really reflects too what we're seeing with our startup and mentioning like it's programming embedded software and other customer service, and those are the things that we're seeing that are growing. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will move it back to Amanda.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. You're a rock star. I am now going to open us up for Q&A. So if you have a question for either Sarah or Garrett, or maybe both, please put it in the chat. We may not get to everyone's questions, but there will be more time in our breakout sessions to pick the brains of each of our panelists. And I am going to just sort of get us started. And I'd like to follow up with both of you on this issue of equity and diversification of our workforce. I would say Black workers, Indigenous, and other people of color it would be fair to say that they were left behind during the conventional energy economy. How do we make sure that they are prioritized for these jobs in the new energy economy? Or do you feel the industry is committed to this?
I'd share that I don't know. I don't know the answer. I feel like this is something where I'm trying to figure out our own theory of change around, because we're just starting to dip our toes into this space and do some after school programming. We're in a majority minority community with in the Youngstown metro area. So there's lots to consider there. And we're having so much fun and hearing such great anecdotal feedback from families when we're building like little digital clocks or showing them how like LED lights work and some of these things. So we're very excited about that space, but that really doesn't answer the question. I will say though, I'm very impressed with, say, Altium that's moved into our community, which is a full new organization. It's not GM, it's not LG Chem. And this is their core value, is making sure that their employees are diverse and represent the community. And they are at the point where they're knocking down doors, and talking to people and really trying to be involved. So I do foresee, at least with the move towards like energy storage and new tech companies, you really having a prominent role with grid modernization, that it will change a lot of the culture.
It's a really interesting question, Amanda. And it ties into a legacy that, I think you highlighted very well. And, many people who work in the industry will say it's conservative, and that can be code for a lot of things. And I think as you look across, especially the utility companies, many of their initiatives are still tackling gender and gender equity and equality, because that's another huge piece that they've been kind of behind the ball on in regards to, in relationship to many other industries. Something that we've seen recently has been actually, and there was a New York Times article, I'm happy to find it and share it in the chat, about First Energy, which is obviously a major investor-owned utility headquartered in Akron, Ohio, but with service territory in Pennsylvania. And they actually tied some of their executive compensation towards hitting diversity and inclusion targets for their workforce. And so it's, not necessarily going to account for all of it. And I'm not an expert on the details of that, plan that they put forth, but I think we are starting to see, not only a realization that it's important and it's something that's been perennially under focused on, but we're starting to see specific and really tangible goals being set and, incentives, or, not necessarily punitive actions if those goals aren't met, which is something that may move throughout the industry.
Thank you for that. You mentioned, Sarah, that as we decentralize, there will be both community and job impacts in Appalachia as we sort of shut down coal plants. I have gotten some sense that Appalachia could be, with the right investments, a hub for energy storage and battery technology. Do either of you have thoughts on that or other such opportunities?
I think going back to Industrial Revolution and the strengths of Appalachia related to the logistics, it certainly can be a strength for manufacturing in the U.S. Certainly, we need policies that support U.S.-based manufacturing, and particularly with battery technology, we're recognizing in order to compete internationally, research and development have to be tied to the manufacturing process. It's much more fluid than, say, a plant we might have seen that we would expect to be there a whole lifetime. They're going to be evolving, as quickly as they can, like a software update. So I do foresee that as a benefit to the region, that historical context. And then very excited to hear about the chatter around hydrogen and potential for carbon capture in Appalachia. So there's plenty of opportunities.
Garrett, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think Sarah captured a lot of it really, really well. Just in terms of a lot of fluidity and continued focus needed on investing in manufacturing capacity in the region. Something we saw during the Obama administration was a series of manufacturing hubs that were funded. And I believe that Northeast Ohio and maybe Pennsylvania had a textiles hub. And so as we think about the forthcoming legislation, there is significant money allocated for research and development purposes, as well as some of the manufacturing support. And I know through our research with Reimagine, we're seeing the potential need for that to kind of be maybe front-loaded, and considering the emphasis that needs to be put early on the manufacturing capabilities and the research capabilities to power some of these grid modernization and clean energy transition activities into the future, to make sure that there's the ability to actually make the number of, whether it's electric vehicles or the transformers that are the gray cans that hang outside your house. Supply chains are a significant challenge in this industry. And for a new utility project, it can take anywhere from 10 to 36 months to get everything through permitting, siting, ordering, and then delivery and construction. And that's a long lead time that we'll probably need to change to meet the pace that's required.
Right. Makes sense. Very good points, both of you. I have a question from Heather. What's the intersection with robotics and grid modernization? Do you have any thoughts on that?
My comment would be, anecdotally, one of the largest utilities, this is where they put their research and development dollars, because safety is their number one priority. And voltages are, especially with everything we're talking about with EV charging and the industrial applications, they're very worried for their line workers. So they're a utility in the metro or in the general region this is where they put their R&D dollars.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So we have
maybe to expand on that a little bit.
Sure, go for it.
The rise of all digital technology. Oh, I was just going to add that, the rise of all digital technologies has really been seen across utilities, whether it's drones for line inspections. People are talking about augmented reality goggles for training and maintenance. And so there's a lot of interest in some of these advanced technologies.
I bet. Let's see, what else do we have here? In the different states that sort of represent Reimagine Appalachia, are there state laws that are helpful or not helpful to your work and what you're trying to do?
It's a nuanced answer. If there's a way afterwards, I can't recall the resource right now, but there's a great state-by-state guide at policies related to new energy innovation adoption. And I know based on that, Pennsylvania is the lead, and like Ohio and West Virginia are fairly tied, and lots of that is based to EV incentives. I would say that sometimes I am jealous of New York State's commitment to workforce development programs around renewables and other aspects of grid modernization. And earlier this week, the governor of Michigan kind of put together her roadmap based on the infrastructure dollars and what she would do. And it was great to see that leadership around this topic.
You gonna add anything, Garrett?
These are intrinsically state issues, and I think that's something that people often can overlook in the federal conversation. Utilities are at their heart regulated by state utility commissions, and those are the bodies generally appointed in some manner by the legislature or governor, who have ultimate oversight over how the utilities at both the investor level and the cooperative level spend their dollars and allocate their infrastructure, costs and determine the rates that you and I pay for the power in our houses. So there is an intrinsically state-focused component. And so as we look across the US, it's not just one regulatory body or one decision-making body at the federal level, it's actually 50. And then there are some additional complexities and some regional cooperation organizations that also have a stake in some of these conversations.
And how does that affect innovation?
That is a great question. It affects it in a couple of ways. So one, the utilities commissions determine how the utilities can spend some of their money on infrastructure. And so their policies can be either favorable or, less than favorable to clean energy. You've seen in a number of states, Ohio included, passage and repeal and, passage of new legislation, providing for funding for clean energy and innovation activities. And then as you think about those collaborative bodies, they often set policy and standards. And so we oftentimes see innovation in the industry when there's a desire to increase resiliency or reliability and apply new technologies to meet that. And those are often, driven out of those collaborative bodies.
And sometimes your Speaker of the House gets arrested for various energy-related reasons. All right, great question, Preston. Let's go to Mark's question. Sarah, he wants to know, when you get inquiries, what kinds of inquiries are you getting? What are they asking for from Bright? And what are you able to give them?
Sure. So per our core mission of empowering founders and our entrepreneur services, I definitely say the number one request is funding. And so part of that is we do assist in what we call non-dilutive funding. So utilizing Department of Energy, NASA, Department of Defense for small business innovation research grants. Without those grants, a lot of our companies wouldn't be able to go to prototype or try their first customer out. So in many ways, that is a big ask. And then looking for partners, whether it's a utility that wants to pilot or a community, it could be a variety of things.
Garrett, do you want? I guess you can't really answer that.
No, I'll let Sarah answer the question about how people
But
ask
yeah, all right.
for support.
All right, we have a question from Henry. You mentioned that it takes 7 years. I think both of you actually touched on this. It takes a long time for electric grid technology to become commercially viable. Do you think mainstreaming and political establishment understand this? Are they maybe not? Maybe a little short-sighted.
I think the economics will work itself out. That's my hope.
One way or the other. Yeah. I think for some, with respect to climate change, hopefully the other and not the one. Anything to add, Garrett? Not going there. All right. Let's see what else I had one question about microgrids. I see a lot about that in the news. I mean, are we gonna have microgrids everywhere?
Yeah, they're really exciting. There's one evolving in downtown Cleveland. There's still some policy decisions needed to make sure that comes to fruition. I think in Ohio, there's a handful just through university campuses where you have combined heating and cooling. I think it's definitely a solution we'll be seeing with rural communities where the traditional infrastructure is too costly. Also seeing PG&E in California are starting to go this way, in part to limit the excessive heat on the wires. I think it's really exciting. It provides for reliable power. However, at this time, it's very cost intensive. It's a huge. It may make sense for a university or a hospital system, but at the residential level, it requires a different model at this time.
Mm-hmm.
With regard to grid modernization, we see a trend towards more microgrid-like solutions. So if you think about a true microgrid as a fully disconnected, collection of poles and wires with its own generating supply, that could be the most, strict definition. But as we think about the grid that exists today, we see a trend towards more decentralization and the ability to route and reroute power around, from various sources. So backfeeding is a way that's often used to describe it, where your power can come, not just from the traditional way that it's come, down the line from the left, the house next to you, your house, and the house after you. But if there was a tree that fell kind of at the start of your street, there would be the ability to bring that power in from the other side to support your electricity needs and provide you with power and restoration sooner. There are challenges, of course, with the true backfeeding, which is when a customer has solar or rooftop solar that may be spinning their meter in the reverse direction, and that can create a safety concern for some of our utility workers. But there is a trend towards more decentralized generation and the grid.
Yeah.
I should comment. My husband actually built us a mini microgrid with Harbor Freight material. It basically only powers our AC if there's a power outage for like a few hours, but it's pretty awesome, and he did it for $1,200. So
what does that mean exactly?
So he got a marine battery, like that you get at an auto store, some panels and an inverter, and a lot of cables. And so it's not connected to the grid. He just has it with various household appliances as more of a interesting hobby, pandemic hobby.
That's cool. And so if the power goes out, your air conditioning will still work.
Yeah, it's just a little scary actually, like to be the only house, and we've had several outages over the summer, and it's kind of weird to be the only house with lights. But kind of, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me that I had read an article about, I don't know, Tesla, or it's one of the solar companies that they own, that they're creating a new housing development in, I want to say Texas, but I'm not sure, that is a microgrid, has the like solar tiles on their roof,
Right.
and then a big battery, and self-propelling, I guess, when needed. And I guess part of the reason that spurred him to go that way is because existing roofs are not well made for solar tiles. So he wanted to put it on new housing so that they could design the house in a way that's friendly to the solar tile. So I thought that was interesting. All right, I am going to end us on a last question from Kelly. For federal funding that will likely be funneled into the region, knock on wood, is there work being done, training programs, for instance, on the ground to help prep the workforce for this new increase in demand that is to come, especially in light of, I think, what you both touched on, that the training for electricians is pretty intense and long?
My answer is going to be not enough. And I think that spans in a couple of places. So I'm less concerned personally about the utility workers, the line people who are out there. They have pretty rigorous and robust training programs and can probably scale to meet demand. My concern more comes from the trend towards electrification of our homes and our businesses. And as we see greater demand for electric vehicles, electric ranges, and that general trend of solar panels on our roofs and batteries in our basements and chargers on our walls, there's a lot of work that can be done by local tradesfolk who maybe they own their own electrical business, maybe they work with a couple of other people in a community, and I don't necessarily see enough training there, and it's something we often talk about anecdotally, that's a challenging space to address.
Yeah, I hope to see like a White House intergovernmental council or something formed in the near future around this, because or at least what I'm seeing is it's who owns what. There's certainly commitment from the state and federal and the utilities and the manufacturers, but it's uncertain who has what responsibility. So I think some guidance would be great to start having more implementation of workforce programs.
All right, great. That's our last question. Now we are going to transition to our breakout session. So you will get an opportunity to sort of pick each of our panelists' brains, and you get to choose which one. So thank you to everyone who has been watching on Facebook via live stream. We are going to now end that live stream as we transition to our breakout rooms. We hope that you had a great opportunity to further engage in conversations around grid modernization. Can we get a volunteer from each group to report back on what you discussed? We'll start with Garrett's group.
I might volunteer Kelly or Michelle on behalf of the group if one of them wants to take it.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I can just give a quick update. So we talked a little bit about just some of the workforce implications around this, some of the federal policy initiatives that are needed. We talked about the way in which we can encourage like local communities to switch over to clean energy. So, rooftop solar and things like that, and policies that prohibit that. We talked a tiny bit about about energy storage, and had a little bit of a conversation on hydrogen. And we talked also about some other things. It was a wide array of conversation in our room. We learned a lot about grid modernization, and we're thankful to have Garrettson's expertise here. So I'll pass it over to the other group.
Unless Michelle wants to add anything to that.
No, it was a really nice discussion. We had a really active little breakout room, and really just touched on as much as we could in our limited time. So thank you so much for leading our discussion, Garrison. It was great talking with you.
Thank you, Michelle. And do we have a volunteer from Sarah's group?
Dan. That's who I thought was.
Hey. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked a lot about, I think, different funding opportunities, like with the Economic Development Agency, and kind of reallocating funding opportunities to, catalyze economic development, but how Bright is kind of interfacing with that in order to kind of, expand their services in other metros and that sort of thing, and reach more people in other areas outside of just immediate Youngstown or the Northeast or the sort of region. We also talked a lot about sort of alternative business models. We had a question about somebody who was from Clarion, I think Catherine was her name, was talking about how broadband access could be extended out to rural areas. And we kind of got into discussion about business models and how potentially there's a need for exploration of alternative business models, because the traditional business models that demand a high ROI from investors may not work in those environments where the capital intensivity to create infrastructure is very high. And so we kind of got into discussion about like, co-ops and, worker cooperatives and those sorts of things. And Sarah was mentioning how, there's a big push in Cleveland for a lot of solar and energy cooperatives. And there hasn't been yet within Bright, but it's something that they would be considering, and also considering, nonprofit models as well for the new business and job creation. Because the fundamental tenet of Bright is for job creation. So however we can create jobs, that's the way that they'd like to move forward.
Which is pretty awesome for a tech incubator. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you again for joining us this evening. And as a reminder, please check out reimaginejobs.org. You'll see more career opportunities as well as more information about grid modernization initiatives. If you're with an organization, you can consider becoming an exhibitor on the site, and you can do that by clicking Become an Exhibitor. Tonight's program is part of a series of monthly programs diving deeper into several sectors that are all articulated on the website. You can follow at Jobs Reimagine on Twitter or at Reimagine Jobs on Instagram, and like Reimagine Jobs on Facebook if you want to stay up to date on the upcoming programs. Our next event will be on September 29th, and we will focus on land reclamation. This is another area that, if knock on wood, budget the budget infrastructure bills pass, we'll get significant amounts of funds. So we hope to see you there. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And this is just the beginning of the conversation.